Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. The 30th session of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP30, has officially begun in the Brazilian city of Belem. It is the world's largest and most crucial climate gathering, bringing together leaders, negotiators and experts for 2 weeks of high-stakes discussions on the urgent need for united global action against climate change. This year's host, Brazil, has described COP30 as a turning point, a moment of truth and a test of global solidarity. The focus, they say, must now shift from negotiations to implementation, fulfilling the past commitments, accelerating climate finance, and stepping up efforts to cut emissions and adapt to the mounting impacts of global warming. Under Brazil's presidency, COP30 is anchored around an ambitious action agenda, 30 key goals, each led by dedicated activation groups aimed at scaling up real-world solutions. So on the show today, we will decode the priorities driving COP30, what makes its approach different, how it aims to scale up the global response to the climate crisis, and why, despite differences and disputes, COP continues to remain the world's most vital platform for collective climate action. To take the conversation forward, I'm joined by two distinguished guests. So let me begin by introducing them to you. I'm joined by Dr. Ritu Mathur, Senior Fellow and Director at TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute. Dr. Mathur, delighted to have you with us on the program today.
My
pleasure.
It
also gives me immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, Senior Fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. Dr. Chaturvedi, glad to have you with us on this telecast as well.
Thank you, Samir.
So Dr. Mathur, allow me to begin the program with you. COP30 is being framed as a shift towards adaptation, resilience, and most importantly, real-world implementation. From your perspective, what are some of the most significant elements that you think make COP30 different from the previous such conferences?
Yeah, so I think very rightly, as you said, and this is how the COP30 is being touted as the implementation COP. So I think we've seen many rounds of negotiations in the earlier COPs, but what is more important is that the what's of where we need to go are better understood by now, but we really need to focus on the how to do it and what is the path forward. So I think with that in context, we are looking at COP30 as a COP which is going to focus on looking at taking whatever has been discussed forward in terms of finding consensus. So the main things on the agenda really are in terms of looking at climate finance. How do we move from Baku to Belem? How do we get a roadmap of putting more finance on the table, something that has been committed? What do we see with regard to CBAM? Again, there are these unilateral trade measures which are being talked about. How do we keep everybody in the room together on this, and how can there be fairness when we start bringing things like unilateral trade measures and CBAM in the discussions? There is the ambition gap, which is being again put on the agenda, which is again important to look at because NDCs have been put forward by countries, but these still stay far from what is required. So what is the gap and how do we move forward on that? And again, the biennial reports or the transparency reports as they are called. And as we are looking at the global stocktake in 28, what are we where do we stand and how do we look at how these BTRs are again understood and taken forward? So I think these are the key agenda items in terms of what will be discussed at COP30 and the hows of how to remain united in this fragmented world and take things forward, take the discussions forward, make things meaningfully impact and work on ground is how we see this particular COP working forward.
I think staying united is an important part, given that we're seeing some of the world's largest emitters actually being absent from an important climate conference like this, where now the focus is more on fast-tracking solutions rather than setting new targets. Dr. Chaturvedi, how do you see this shift from commitments to implementation, and especially for large economies, for developing countries, for growing countries such as India?
Great. First of all, let me also take a step back and talk about the larger context. So one thing you already touched upon, that the whole context of frayed multilateralism. And I think that's extremely important because all the earlier COPs are about cooperation. Trust and cooperation are extremely important in these sort of discussions. And we have seen what has happened in the last 6 months in terms of how the world order is unraveling. And that has become a very important context. In fact, in this time, the US has not even sent their negotiators, which is probably a good thing. But that is what has happened. And in fact, why I'm emphasizing this is because in all the Brazilian presidencies, you could say follow up in the COP related discussions. Multilateralism is something that they have been saying again and again is the core of what they're trying to ensure, that cooperation and not really frayed arrangement is what they are gunning for. So that's a very important context, but that's a larger geopolitical context behind this COP. The second is the climate context, and that's where I would want to highlight the speech given by the UN Secretary General, and the speech very clearly mentioned a term. The term is called overshoot. And overshoot is now coming more and more into the discussion. I just want to explain it simple way what it means for like all of us. So overshoot means essentially that the world was talking about a limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C. But now, at least in a temporary phase, we have already overshot that target, and the expectation is that given the way the emissions are evolving, the world will overshoot this 1.5 degree C target by 2030 decisively, right? But what does that mean? Does that mean that we should leave 1.5 degree C just because we've already passed it? Well, that is what the UN Secretary General's speech was about. That even though we have temporarily passed it and maybe we will decisively pass it, we should not abandon that goal. And overshoot simply means we will overshoot for maybe a few years, maybe a decade or 20 or 2 decades, but we should come back. So the curve, the temperature curve essentially goes beyond 1.5, maybe reaches 1.7 or 1.8, and then comes back to 1.5. So that's the kind of effort we have to make. So these are the two very important contexts. One is more geopolitical context behind this COP. The second is the temperature or climate context behind this COP, within which this is situated. So it already makes it very different. And the second thing, as Ritu has said already very clearly, that this COP, the Brazilian presidency has very clearly been articulating it. It's not really about more promises. This is about delivering on these promises. So the question is, what do we need for actual delivery now? So we are not looking for any more grand announcements. We're looking for predictable delivery of low-cost finance to the developing world. How do we ensure that the process of accessing finance becomes something that is a conducive process? It should not be a very painful process. So those kinds of things on finance, for example, is very important. Second is adaptation. Adaptation is also very important agenda for this COP. Something called the global goal on adaptation, in which many indicators on adaptation are being finalized. So just to simplify what adaptation means, as climate change is happening, as we are already seeing a lot of impacts that is happening on communities and ecosystems, how do we prepare ourselves better in this changing climate to adapt to this changing climate essentially and still be resilient? So the idea is to enhance resilience, and then there are many processes or you could say indicators that are being designed to measure how do we measure how resilient we are and how adaptive we can be. So I think this COP also has an important agenda to better understand how do we kind of measure adaptation, and is there a goal, where do we want to reach in terms of enhancing our resilience. So finance is one big thing. The second is adaptation for this particular COP, and we want to go beyond big announcements and promises, but we actually want to create structures that deliver on both of these promises to ensure that both communities and ecosystem become more resilient. At the same time, even if overshoot happens, we come back to 1.5 degrees C. So those kinds
Certainly.
of
So, in fact, the action agendas at COPs are built on voluntary pledges. We've seen many such pledges have been made in the past. COP30 is different in so many ways because it doesn't set new targets. It talks about how together we can prepare a roadmap that will help us deliver on the past climate promises that countries have made. Towards that goal, one key development that took place just ahead of COP30 was the Baku to Belem roadmap report for 1.3 trillion, which was prepared by the COP29 and COP30 presidencies, and it sets out some priorities, which I'll go across to Dr. Mathur to explain about how realistic are they in terms of achieving the desired outcomes that countries set for themselves, and what this roadmap lays out. Dr. Mathur.
Yeah, so again, I think from when we're talking about the Baku to Belem roadmap, it's basically the finance part that we are targeting. And what was brought out as $1.3 trillion per year to be put forward by the developed countries to the developing world per year till 2030. Now, what we've seen in the past is, just a meager fraction of this. That itself, has been very little. And additionally, as Webb have also mentioned, we are already starting to see the effects of climate change. So the requirements also for climate action on the adaptation part are increasing even further. So it makes it doubly difficult, especially for developing countries, to find enough finance to take care of the mitigation needs along with development, as well as look at building their resilience, whether it's in terms of resilience of communities or resilience of infrastructure, agriculture, etc. So in terms of requiring much more transparency in terms of what can be put on the table, what the brass tacks are in terms of how this will be done. And also making sure that this is done in a way that the finance doesn't end up creating a further problem in terms of increasing the debt of countries. So again, low-cost finance or grants. In what modality will this finance be made available is also very important. If we look at the cost of financing, it's again the interest rates in developing countries are generally much higher than in the developed world, making it more difficult for developing countries to bring forth the money to undertake climate action. So it's also about in what form and modalities the climate finance is made available and how much money is put on the table. Also about MDBs. I think this again brings into context what should be the changing role of multilateral development banks, and again the discussion needs to center on that as well. So I think there are many agenda items which relate with how greater climate finance can be mobilized. Of course, there is a greater role for the private sector as well, which they need to play. And again, policies can partly play a role in guiding more private finance. But again, I think at this platform, we need to see much more action rather than promises, and a way to see that there would be significant and transparent climate finance put on the table in terms of the modalities of how this would work.
Absolutely. So I think the scale of change that is needed given the current situation, it's enormous, and at least the number that this report puts it at is at least $1.3 trillion in climate investments every year for the next 10 years, that is by 2035. I'll bring the focus more towards home, Dr. Chaturvedi, talking about what are India's key priorities going into COP30. I believe both of you will be also representing, or will be also there at Belem. But if you could give us a sense of what we're going to see New Delhi push in terms of climate finance, adaptation, just transition, rather than new mitigation targets, because that's clearly out of question. We are only talking about how we are going to push harder towards commitments that have been made in the past, say at COP28, COP29, that's been more relevant, more contemporary.
Sure. So just first of all, I wanted to clarify one thing. Under the Paris process, all countries are expected to submit their 2035 contributions. So that will happen, but those are not grand. I think we should differentiate between new with grand. right? So new announcements are expected to happen, not because this is a big COP, but that is because it is a part of the Paris process. Every 5 years, countries are expected to announce their new nationally determined contributions, and many countries have done so, and India is also expected to announce it very soon. It could do it within during this COP or just after that COP. But that's something which is like a new announcement, a new target. That is also very important. That will happen. But these are not going to be grand announcements as we have seen in many COPs, which are not being delivered on. These are actionable announcements that all the governments are making, including India is expected to make it very soon. So that is one thing I just want to clarify. The second thing in terms of India's core priorities. The first is clearly it's finance, but it's not. I mean, India last year in Baku tried really hard, and there was a very fiery speech also by our lead negotiator on finance, which was clearly expressing the frustration of the developing world that so much finance has been needed, and it is there are many independent estimates. It's not just that the governments are asking for finance; there are actually many independent estimates, high-level estimates also, which are talking about the magnitude of finance that is needed in the developing world. But unfortunately, what the developed world committed, which is $300 billion in terms of the money that could come from the developed world, where they are also going to take lead, plus $1.3 trillion, which is all the money coming from all the sources. So those are grossly inadequate. But all said and done, even if we are kind of unhappy about it in the developing world, that deal is done. So now the question is, whatever number has been agreed upon, even whichever way it is inadequate, how do you end up delivering on it? Because it is entirely possible that you have made a promise which is itself a disappointing promise, but you even don't end up delivering on that. That is also possible. So the question now is to create those systems of accountability that you actually measure the actual delivery on finance by the developed world. So this whole roadmap talks about that kind of thing, and it tries to create structure. So this whole point about Baku to Belem roadmap and what are the India's, you could say, core position or want from this COP, they're very much aligned, because one of the core asks of India is about creating those kind of predictable processes which will deliver on finance. And that's where the finance, this roadmap, I'll talk about quickly about that, because it talks about 5 R's. That's how it is framed it. And the first R is about, they call it replenishing, which is about a lot of concessional finances there in the world. How do you replenish concessional finance? Second is about rebalancing. Essentially, there is a lot of fiscal space and debt sustainability. If you know, African countries are in big debt, and whatever climate finance actually comes to these countries, this is high interest. So they continue to be in that debt cycle. They're trapped in the debt cycle. Climate finance has to ensure that they don't, they kind of get out of that debt cycle and don't get stuck into that. So that's the rebalancing thing that the roadmap talks about. Then it also talks about something they call rechanneling of private finance, right? How do you rechannel private finance? Then they talk about revamping, which is about enhancing capacity and coordination between institutional actors. And then finally, it talks about reshaping the global financial architecture to be a lot more aligned with climate investments, right? So all of this is actually, in terms of the framing, it is very well aligned with what India is asking. It is also puts equity and climate justice at the center. So in that sense, the Belem roadmap, whatever has been proposed, is very good. But at the end of the day, it is again a framework document. It hasn't got a lot of specificities in terms of how finance will be delivered and measured. So it is lacking in that sense, and that's what
Right,
India
and
is
also I think for any such roadmap, howsoever good it is on paper, the key lies in the implementation. And climate finance, we all know, has been a big sticking point. Although this roadmap lays out key priorities, we'll have to wait and see how it's implemented, how countries agree to it, and especially in today's context, where we are seeing countries like the United States actually not being present at one of the biggest climate conferences in the world, where you expect global solidarity to fight the dangers of global warming. In that context, Dr. Mathur, although it's more of a geopolitical question, but for India at COP30, we see both an opportunity and a diplomatic test to take lead as well as the climate issues are concerned, because India, we've seen right during its G20 presidency to even now, we have emerged as a voice for the global south. now with bigger countries absent from COP30, what expectations do you think the smaller developing countries, particularly in the global south, have from India's leadership, and given the kind of transition that we've seen India go through over the last few years at this COP?
Yeah, so again, I think it is very clear that India is actually playing a key role in terms of being able to also exhibit its leadership for the global south, but also as a country. I think there have been several policies, several initiatives that the country has put forward. And I mean, specifically, if we look at, achieving the 50% non-fossil capacity in our NDC, we've already, sort of achieved that. Moving towards the 500 gigawatt goal again, we are making big strides with regard to renewable energy, and the costs have come down. But again, we are upscaling our focus towards renewables, also moving towards electric vehicles. I think there are a plethora of things which the country has done in terms of moving forward. And again, as we are looking at, ramping up this action, I think we've also relooked at the estimates of renewable energy to see how things can be upscaled apart from, the ground-mounted solar, for instance, to using solar panels as floating solar or as building integrated PVs, BIPV as they are called, or agriculture PV. So there are different ways and very innovative ways in which, again, some of these technologies which can lend themselves to cleaner energy and decarbonization in moving forward. I think we are making great strides. We have taken lots of actions. Again, I think as a voice of the Global South, earlier the Prime Minister had put forward the Mission Life, which is, again, looking at lifestyles where each individual can sort of move forward in terms of bringing in efficiencies into the way they consume and also sort of reducing the footprint on the planet. So I think again, India is taking a very holistic view, whether it is in terms of how we are being able to progress with cleaner technologies, whether it is the kind of mandate that we want to take up at an individual level, or whether it is in terms of looking at how we sort of drive innovation to, sort of upscale the various elements to integrate development and decarbonization together. Even if we look at, how the emission intensity of the country has moved forward, we have been reducing our emission intensity consistently over time quite rapidly. So again, we've been doing things very differently from how the developed countries earlier did their development. And from that perspective, again, for all the smaller developing countries, I think we've been able to show that there are ways, and that's the leadership again that we can show of how to move forward as you develop, but also simultaneously decarbonizing. With regard to, again, being able to show the way forward as a leader of the Global South, I think there are several opportunities when we look at the green transition, where India can be the leading voice. I think we have opportunities because of also our size of the market. We've been able to test things in the developing country contexts, and that is where we can also, sort of scale things up to work in other developing countries like Africa. So again, the solar aspects or the renewable aspects of how we've tried to upscale things on ground in India are being tried, tested, and applied also in other parts of the world. And again, in terms of whether it is finance related, whether it's trade related measures, I think again, India can be a voice for much of the Global South. And I think we see that leadership from India as well.
Certainly. Let's hope that COP30 gives India that opportunity to push for stronger commitments and meet the expectations of the smaller economies, because as Dr. Mathur rightly explained to us, that at a time when we are seeing that even the developed countries have not fully met their commitments, India has balanced its developmental imperatives with the global demand for faster decarbonization, and especially the kind of transition that we've seen in the last few years. To wrap up the conversation, Dr. Chaturvedi, although we know you'll be in Belem next week, and that perhaps will be the best time to connect with you, speak to you about the conversations that are taking place there, and the kind of progress that perhaps leaders will hope to see at the end of 2 weeks. But if I were to ask you about one biggest expectation that you have from COP30 over the next 2 weeks in Belem, something that perhaps you could define, you could say that can define climate narrative for the world for the next decade ahead?
I do think something a lot more concrete on finance as well as adaptation, both. Those are very important. And the third thing I would say, just to add on to what Ritu said, I think India's diplomatic power is to hold developed world to account. And that's extremely important. So because what we have seen in the last few decades, the developed world has made a lot of promises. It continues to shift its mitigation burden on the developing world. It's not giving any finance or technology support, and nothing is happening. So that is where India comes in. So if you look at what India has been trying to do in the last 10 years, has been extremely articulate and very powerfully articulate about holding the developed world to account on the issues of climate equity and justice. That I'm very sure India will continue to do at the stage of COP, and hopefully, that's how we'll push them to act on whatever promises they've made, along with delivering on finance as well as adaptation, terms.
Okay, Dr. Mathur, one quick comment from you on perhaps what would a successful COP30 look to you? Perhaps at the end we will be talking about how the needle has moved beyond declarations and commitments to at least 1 inch closer towards implementation.
Yeah, so to me, I think 3 words. One, I expect something to move forward in terms of finance, because I think that's one of the biggest hindrances. The second, I think resilience is extremely important in the light of climate change already happening, and therefore something happening in terms of also the global goal on adaptation and commitment happening at that end as well. And I think just transition, again, is a very important element where we need to see much more justice, much more equity for the transition, especially in the global south and in the developing countries. So whether we can get something moving on that front.
So despite the disputes, the disagreements that we are seeing among countries, let's hope there are enough reasons to be positive as well. Fingers crossed, let's hope that after 2 weeks, when we sit for a discussion, we will be talking about something concrete, something that the developing world will have to cheer. With that, we'll have to wrap up this conversation. Thank you once again, Dr. Chaturvedi, Dr. Mathur, for joining us for such an insightful and engaging conversation. To your viewers, thank you very much for your time as well.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.